Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the threat of rain. First of all, I'd like to introduce my wife, Eileen McGann. She is the co-author of this book. It was written with Eileen McGann. It's the third book she's ghosted for me, but the first one she's let me put her name on. And we are currently looking at possibly doing another book, in which case we will be co-authors. And I hope that that's a permanent feature of our life, for two reasons. One, it means we'll write books together. The other, it means she won't have thrown me out of the house. When we both read Living History, we both wanted to have a DNA test to be sure that this was the same lady that we had known for 25 years. I mean, everything about her was different. I don't just mean physical appearance. That was totally different. She does not have turquoise blue eyes. She has brown eyes. She has very thick, used to have very thick Coke bottle glasses. And, well, the cosmetic stuff you can know. I mean, you can figure out. But what was really disturbing about it is that there was a complete mask. Every politician wears makeup to cover a blemish or two. But only Hillary really wears a complete mask, where you have absolutely no clue what she's like reading her memoirs. Now, I haven't read Bill Clinton's memoirs yet. They come out tomorrow. But I can assure you that if you read those memoirs, you'll know all about Bill Clinton. In fact, you'll know far more about him than you ever cared to know. Because he goes on and on and on and on and on about, you know, his various struggles in life, and he doesn't hide things. I mean, he hides what he's doing with who, when, but I mean, other than that, he basically, what you see is what you get. And when you think about our other presidents throughout history, that basically has been the case with each of them. We knew who Harry Truman was, for goodness sakes, and Eisenhower, and Kennedy. We didn't know everything about that he was doing, but he was who he said he was. Lyndon Johnson used to pretend he was this dignified guy till he lifted up a beagle by his ears and showed his appendix scar on national TV. And that gave us a pretty good feel as to what he was like. Ronald Reagan, the irony is that Reagan was an actor who was used to playing other people. But in the Oval Office, he only played himself. And Bush was too geeky and, you know, sort of awkward to be anything other than what he was, a sort of awkward Eastern preppy. And W, what you see is what you get, a macho Texas, you know, cowboy turned president. So, but Hillary Clinton wears a mask, just a complete alternate persona. And in that, she has in common with only one other politician of our time, and that's Richard Nixon, who had a persona that he presented to us that was completely different from the man that we ultimately met in the Watergate tapes. The one Nixon hated swearing. Adlai Stevenson once used the word hell in the 1956 campaign, and Nixon was offended and complained about it for a month. And then you listen to him on the Watergate tapes, and it's every other word it was expletive deleted. But the problem is that you get no clue, no sense of who Hillary Clinton is by what she says in her books. For example, Hillary says the week after 9/11, she went on the Today Show and told Katie Couric and Jane Pauley that Chelsea had decided this would be a great day for a jog around the towers of the World Trade Center, and that day, 9/11, Chelsea set out to jog around the towers, stopped into a coffee shop, and at that moment the airplane hit, and that she actually heard the plane hit. And Katie Couric, moved by that, introduced the segment by saying, on 9/11, Hillary Clinton was not just a senator, she was a concerned parent. And, you know, God, I mean, you can just feel the goosebumps rising when someone would say that their own daughter's life was in jeopardy. Well, I hate to spoil the party, but 3 months later, Chelsea wrote an article for Talk magazine where she said she was staying at a friend's apartment at 29th and Park Avenue, over 4 miles from Ground Zero. and the friend called her and said, "Turn on the TV, you can't imagine what's going on," she flipped on the TV, saw the second airplane hit on television in the privacy of her room. So why would Hillary do this? Why would she make up something of completely whole cloth and do it on the Today Show and national television? Why would she say that she was named after Sir Edmund Hillary, climbed Mount Everest? The only problem was he did it 5 years after she was born and had, like, never left New Zealand at the time she was born. Why would she say she experienced the evils of discrimination playing junior high school intramural soccer? Well, okay, except for the problem that her junior high school only started that program in 1982, at which point she was at the tender age of 37. Now, when Al Gore says that he's the father of the internet, okay, that's a stretch, but it's not whole cloth. The internet began as a method for the Pentagon to stay in touch with its bases around the world, basically as a cost-saving measure. And the bill that set that up was sponsored by a guy named Al Gore. So, I mean, he may not have been the father, but he certainly was present at the birth. And was Love Story after Al and Tipper? Well, no, but his roommate wrote Love Story, his college roommate, and there were scenes in it that were typical of Al and Tipper. Not any of the funny, crazy ones, but some of them. And so, I mean, that's an exaggeration. Politicians do that. But to completely make up a story, especially about 9/11, in her new home state, 1 week after this catastrophe, why would she do it? So Eileen and I were batting that around, and we decided that what it is that she grew up politically at the knee of Bill Clinton. And she saw this politician who relates effortlessly to anybody. He doesn't have to manufacture charisma. He just uncorks the bottle and the charm flows out. There's this attractiveness, this ability to relate to anybody, this almost antenna where he knows what you're thinking and he studies the faces and relates to you. And she can't do that. So when she showed up at the rally at Madison Square Garden for the cops and the firemen and the rescue workers and the families of the 9/11 victims, she was booed off the stage. You couldn't imagine that happening to Bill Clinton. He'd be biting his lower lip, tears would be welling up in his eyes, everybody would be sobbing and hugging everybody, and there would be a real bonding going on. But Hillary can't do that. So she has to invent an artificial construct to put her at the scene, to say, I'm just like one of you, I'm the same as you. I'm just a parent whose daughter was almost killed at 9/11, and I'm bonding with you. Or when she tries to pretend that she's adventuresome and her name is the name of the world's greatest mountain climber. There's a need to sort of assimilate charisma by borrowing it by these stories. Now, sometimes the stories are of minor consequence. Sometimes, though, they are a defense mechanism to deal with criticism that she gets. And here what she tries to do is to hide out and be one of the herd. She likes to say, oh, you're not criticizing Hillary. You're criticizing women, or professional women, or lawyers who are women, or activist, outspoken women. That's who you're really criticizing, not me. So remember in the 1992 campaign, she said that mothers who stay at home but bake cookies and serve tea, and that's all they do. And that was just a very controversial comment. Well, obviously, the reason it was controversial was it was a put-down. She was saying that these women who stay home have nothing to do but bake cookies and serve tea. But in Living History, here's how she defends that comment. The attacks reflected the extent to which our society was still adjusting to the changing roles of women. While Bill talked about social change, I embodied it. I had my own opinions, interests, and profession. For better or worse, I was outspoken. I represented a fundamental change in the way women functioned in our society. I had been turned into a symbol for women of my generation. That's all true. And it's to her credit that it is true. But it has nothing to do with the criticism she got for that crazy comment. It wasn't that she embodied social change. It was that she was putting down people who didn't happen to share her particular priorities. Or when she was at the Rose Law Firm in Arkansas, and her husband was the governor of the state. she happened to get a lot of state business at the Rose Law Firm. So she was criticized for that. And how does she defend herself against that criticism of a conflict of interest? This is the sort of thing that happens to women who have their own careers and their own lives, and I think it's a shame, but I guess it's something we're going to have to live with. Those of us who've tried and have a career, tried to have an independent life to make a difference, and certainly like myself who has children, you know, I've done the best I can to lead my life. What? This has nothing to do with juggling career and family. It has to do with your husband's the governor of the state and you're getting legal fees to represent the state. If she were a 75-year-old man, she would have been criticized for the same stuff. But there's this defense mechanism of pretending she's normal and kind of hiding within the herd. By the way, that story about the legal work is an interesting one. The state of Arkansas was suing to stop utility rates from going up. And Bill Clinton needed a really good lawyer to do that lawsuit, so he chose Hillary, which made a lot of sense. Then I came home one night and I told Eileen that he had done that, and Eileen said, and she's getting paid for that? And I said, I guess she is. And Eileen said, she's going to get killed for that politically. So I went back the next time I was in Arkansas and I said, you know, Eileen thinks that it's not a good idea for you to get paid for this. And she erupts, Hillary erupts and says, our law firm has always represented the state. We represented the state for years. The only reason I'm doing it is so that we can win this case and we can make sure that it comes out okay and blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay, Hillary, that's cool, that's fine. Why don't you continue to represent the state and just divide the firm into two parts? One pot of money, which is the state business that you don't share in, and the other pot of money would be the rest of the firm's business that you would share in. And she said, fine, that's great, no problem. About 6 months later, Vince Foster sent a memo around that explained that she had increased her take from the portion of the pool that was not related to state business, so that it all came out the same. Part of what Hillary does in living history is she goes through every one of the financial scandals of the Clinton years and of the Clinton administration. And she repeats the same justifications and the same arguments and the same excuses that they used all throughout that time. Now, it is perfectly rational when you're the first lady and you're under attack and your husband is under attack to go ahead and do that. I mean, what else is she going to do? Say, oh, I'm guilty? She's not going to do that. But why? But when she repeats all of this in her memoirs, not for political gain, but just to avoid, just so she can make $8 million. And when she repeats all of the same justifications, you have a real sense that she may have learned absolutely nothing. So, for example, she says that when she turned $1,000 into $100,000 in the commodities market. By the way, in her book signings, I thought everybody should go to them just for financial advice. I mean, you know, name one other how-to speaker who tells you the ways of Wall Street who has a track record half that good. She says in her book that she was exonerated in that. Well, she wasn't. She wasn't prosecuted because the statute of limitations had run. It had elapsed. And why had it elapsed? Well, in 1982, Clinton was running for governor against Frank White, the guy who had beaten him for governor in 1980. And I said, hey, you know, Frank White's refusing to release his tax returns. Why don't you release yours? We can really embarrass him. And Clinton said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's go do that. And then when the time came to release the tax returns, I said, so what years are you going to release? 79 and 80, which was the years you were governor? He said, oh, no, not that, not that. I'll release last year, 81. And I said, what good is 81? You're out of office. The goal is you release the stuff while you're in office and demand that he do the same thing. I'm not going to do that. I said, but why not? I'm not going to do that. Bill, did you hear me? I'm not going to do that. And then 10 years later, I learned why. He wanted to hide the commodities winnings so that so that the statute of limitations would have lapsed by the time anybody found out about it. By the way, while we're on the subject of Bill Clinton quotes, when I first met Bill Clinton, it was 1977, and he was the Attorney General in Arkansas. And I met with him in his office, and we had a great meeting. We just hit it off, and there was electricity flying back and forth, and really the beginning of a long, good relationship. And at the end of it, I had to go to the bathroom. So I asked where it was, and he said, "It's all the way in the back of my office. You make a right there." So I did, and it looked like a finished basement, his office. You'd swear there should be a pool table in the middle of the floor. And so I went to the bathroom, and I closed the door, and there was this huge pin-up on the door of this gorgeous blonde spilling out of a tiny white bikini. So after I got out, I said, "You know, this is the Bible Belt, sir. You think it's cool to have this, you know, on the door?" And he said, "Don't you know who that is?" And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "That's Dolly Parton." And I said, "Who?" And he said, "Oh, man, you really are from New York." Now, some of the stuff that Hillary obscures in living history is stuff that is absolutely to her credit and a terribly important part of who she is. And this was probably the most disappointing thing to me in reading her book, which is the Hillary that I've admired, the Hillary that I liked, the Hillary that I really felt was excellent, makes no appearance in this book. This bland, sort of goody two-shoes housewife subsumes it entirely. Let me just find this. The time that I really got to know Hillary best and got really to like her was in 1982 when she stepped in and ran Bill's campaign after he had been defeated for governor in 1980. And she took over and she absolutely ran his life and the campaign. And boy, she is a great manager. You know, Bill is not. He's a procrastinator and inefficient and wandering, and he thinks self-discipline is something he'd like to have for dessert one night. Hillary is the most disciplined person I know. So Bill basically turned the management of the campaign over to Hillary, and she was brilliant. I felt like a good violinist in an orchestra with a great conductor. She was superb. But in the book, there's no mention of that, absolutely none. She says, "Oh, the comeback campaign was a family endeavor. We loaded Chelsea, diaper bag and all, into a big car as we drove around the state. We started in the South, where spring had snuck in under the pine trees, and ended in Fayetteville in a snowstorm. I've always liked campaigning and traveling through Arkansas, stopping at county stores, sale barns, and barbecue joints. With Chelsea on my hip, I walked up and down the streets meeting voters. Yeah, maybe twice, 3 times. What she mainly did was sit next to me writing negative ads the whole campaign." But no indication of that in the book. In 1992, I would sit next to her at the mansion, the governor's mansion, which was the transition office. And with a pencil, we would work on the cabinet choices. And she basically designed her husband's cabinet and his administration. And I think did a very good job with few bad apples, but for the most part, a pretty good cabinet. In her book, no credit for that at all. She says that the only comment she makes about the transition is, "We face the same problems most couples face when the husband is transferred and gets a new job. We had to move to a new location, and all our friends came and helped with the packing, and Loretta Avent, my good friend, yelled up the stairs, 'Hillary, are we taking?' I'll spare you the rest." But this absolutely ridiculous scene that has nothing to do with who Hillary Clinton really is. But it is very important that we find out who Hillary is, because she might very well be our president. And there is developing a perfect storm of elements that are laying the basis for a Hillary Clinton candidacy for president. If John Kerry loses, I think Hillary is virtually guaranteed of the Democratic nomination in '08. And, you know, if Kerry loses, there'll have been 8 years of Bush, and by then people will hate him even more. And, you know, it'll be hard for him to keep his hold on the public's imagination, or for the Republican Party to do it. There'll be a real sense of the need to alternate power. And the country itself is becoming more Democrat at the rate of 0.5% a year. That's as a result of black and Hispanic in-migration. So you look at the election right now for Bush, and the poor guy lost to Gore by 0.5 point in the popular vote. Nader got 3 points, and the country's gotten 2 points more Democrat. So he's got to gain 6 points just to break even, and just to have a tie election. And in 4 years, that's going to be even more, and in 8 years, even more. The Clintons control the fundraising apparatus of the Democratic Party. Hillary has not done much in the Senate. There's no major bill or amendment, nothing she ever introduced passed, even the remotest amendment, no hearings, no initiatives, kind of nothing. But what she's done is to go to 127 fundraisers for other senators and other members of Congress and other governors in other states and develop IOUs from those people that she can cash in when she runs for president. So there's a very good chance that we could end up with a Hillary Clinton presidency. If Kerry wins and goes for re-election in '08, regardless of how that turns out, she's a very likely candidate in 2012. The polls show she could have won the nomination in '04. She had 3 times the vote of all of the other candidates combined at the start of the election. So what is Hillary Clinton really like? The book offers us no clue. So we went beneath the book to the Hillary Clinton that Eileen and I have known for over 2 decades to really explore that. Well, there's good news and there's bad news. I believe that the time that I really began to break with Hillary, the time that I really began to worry about her, was after the Monica Lewinsky scandal, because Bill Clinton called me and told me the truth about the Lewinsky scandal. He called me on the day the story broke, and he said, I didn't do what they said I did, but I may have done so much that I can't prove my innocence. I really screwed up with this girl. And I had no idea what he meant until months and months later, and then I said, oh no, you don't mean that. Yeah, I guess you do. But I knew that Monica Lewinsky and Linda Tripp were telling the truth, because he told me that. And then I watched as Hillary and these detectives that she kept on the payroll went after Monica, went after Linda, and just tore them apart. They were stalkers. It was a vast right-wing conspiracy. They were blackmailing the president. She brought presidential knee pads to Washington. It was coercive. Poor Linda Tripp's personnel file was illegally released. She sued subsequently and collected $500,000 from the Pentagon for the violation of her privacy rights. She was indicted. She was tried for the crime of taping Monica Lewinsky, and thank goodness she was acquitted. Can you imagine if the only person that went to jail in that whole thing was Linda Tripp? And I looked at the way these detectives descended on these women. Now, when I worked for Bill Clinton, I had no idea if Paula Jones or Jennifer Flowers were telling the truth. Okay, I'd assumed they weren't, because Clinton told me they weren't. But then when I saw what they did to these women who were telling the truth, it really began to raise concerns. And then when he admitted that Jennifer Flowers and he had had an affair, Hillary, by the way, still dismisses her allegations as a whale of a tale in her book and makes no mention of the tape recordings of conversations between Jennifer and Bill Clinton. And Hillary, in her book, still denies the Paula Jones story and makes light of the fact that they had to pay her $850,000 to settle the case. And in her book makes not one mention, not one word, about her husband being stripped of his law license for 5 years as a result of perjuring himself in the depositions in that Paula Jones case. Not one word about that. That's not living history. But when you look back at this record, it is a record that reminds you of J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon. 30, 40, 50 women had their backgrounds dug up by these detectives. Every DWI, every custody case, every divorce case, every arrest record, every property tax issue, everything that ever happened in these, of an abortion, all of this stuff came out. And they would present these women with this information and say, you have to sign an affidavit denying that you'd had a relationship with Bill Clinton. And it began to really make me sick. And the big part of Hillary that gives me this tremendous pause is this ruthlessness, this absolute determination to personally crush anybody that gets in her way. And you have to understand why Hillary is that way. It is because she honestly and deeply and sincerely believes in her own virtue and her own goodness. Bill Clinton is somebody who's in politics because he needs it because of his neurosis. He needs the attention, he needs the affection, he needs the reflected self-image. Unless somebody's paying attention to him, the guy literally can't digest his food. He has attention deficit disorder. When he's not getting enough attention, he's disordered. So he's entered the only business where people are always paying attention to you. Sometimes he reminds me of a headlight reflector on the highway. You'd swear that it was shining, but it's not. It's just reflecting your headlight beams coming back at you. And Bill enters politics for his own emotional needs. He's a pragmatist. If you don't like him, call him an opportunist. And once he's there, he wants to do the best he can because he's there, and he'll be the best president he could be. But there's no guiding ideology. People used to say, what does Bill Clinton stand for? He's a pragmatist. He doesn't really have an ideology. Hillary's very different. She has a very clear view of what she stands for. And it's a focus on the problems of women and children, largely with government intervention and state activity. And she is a very sincerely dedicated liberal ideologue. And if you like that stuff, she's your girl. This is no act. This is nothing she's putting on just to win elections, something she deeply believes. And it's one of the things that's so valuable and important about her, and it makes all of this phoniness so sickening, because underneath there's something really valuable and important there that she represents. But she is so convinced of her own virtue, and so convinced that anybody who disagrees with her can't possibly be righteous. She once said, I wonder if someone can be a Republican and a Christian at the same time. Can you imagine that? So she is so convinced of her own rectitude that she ends up being totally ruthless in the means she uses to achieve power. Her ends to her are so virtuous and so good that it's okay if Mother Teresa, on the way to feed the starving kids in Calcutta, hijacks a jet to get there sooner. It's okay because of the purity of her objectives. The other problem is that that sense of her own virtue kindles a sense of financial entitlement that leads her to dance on the edge of scandal. Now, we really have not had a president who stole serious amounts of money since Warren G. Harding. But Hillary came very close. Now, I'm not blaming her so much for the commodities stuff or the Whitewater stuff. There were small amounts of money involved. She says she was exonerated in Whitewater. She wasn't. Jim McDougal was dead. Susan McDougal wasn't talking because Bill was going to pardon her, and she got a full pardon and got out of jail get out of jail free card. And Bill and Hillary obviously weren't talking. But after she had made money, after that sense of financial insecurity that she writes of with Chelsea's birth had been assuaged, after she had some reason to believe that things were okay, and she had an $8 million book deal, and he had a $12 million book deal, and he had a $10 million a year income, she still filched the White House china. and registered a gift registry at a Midwestern department store, and had friends or supporters or donors send in $10,000 checks and buy 24 pieces of Spode china, as well as silver and all kinds of other stuff to decorate her household. This from a woman who, in the only house she ever lived in that she owned, the 1981 home she lived in between the governorships, every glass was from a different mobile gas station. You know, I mean, there were no two plates that were alike. It was always pizza at night. But yet they developed this sense of entitlement, this sense of financial acquisitiveness, this feeling that she had forsaken a blue-chip law firm, a Wellesley, Yale Law, to go to work in this godforsaken state and help her husband help people in that state. By the way, I don't mean New York. So the negative side of Hillary is, again, quite Nixonian. I don't think there's any difference between Richard Nixon struggling to get every last campaign contribution in 1972 before the campaign disclosure law took effect, and Hillary struggling to get every last gift in before she took the oath of office as a senator and the gift ban took effect. I don't think there's any difference between the plumber's unit burglarizing Daniel Ellsberg's office, psychiatrist's office, to dig up files, to compromise the person who released the Pentagon Papers, and Hillary hiring a slew of private detectives to rout through the garbage of these women, literal and figurative, and blackmail them into silence. But if that's all Hillary Clinton were, this would not be nearly as important a discussion as it is. Because there's another figure that Hillary reminds me of, the young Robert F. Kennedy, the Robert F. Kennedy before JFK's death. Think about the similarities. They hold the exact same seat in the United States Senate. That's Bobby Kennedy's seat she's in. one as a carpetbagger from another state, after her namesake left the White House and was still very popular, during whose administration they had each served as the alter ego, sheltering their president from scandal. Bobby Kennedy sheltering John Kennedy from Marilyn Monroe, and Hillary sheltering Bill from Monica Lewinsky. Our standards are dropping, what can I tell you? And each disgraced themselves in office. Bobby by wiretapping Martin Luther King, by being chief counsel to the McCarthy Committee, a minority counsel to the McCarthy Committee investigating imaginary communists, violating the civil liberties of steel executives just because they raised the price of steel and of labor leaders, and Hillary with all of these private detectives. Yet each served a fundamental function in broadening the outlook of their president. Bobby made John pay attention to issues of race and poverty, and Hillary made Bill pay attention to the problems of women and children. Now, when Bobby left office, when JFK was killed, he changed. He became a very different person. He began to understand that the purity of means and the purity of ends are closely interrelated, that you can't have one without the other. He began to understand that ruthlessness begets ruthlessness, causes a cycle of violence, and ended up in the assassination of his brother. He began to understand the need to make gentle the ways of man, was one of his most favorite quotes. And one wonders if Hillary Clinton can go through a similar process of growth. Because there's something very important there inside of Hillary. In 1995, Hillary went to the Women's Rights Convention in China. And she stood up there on the platform and she said, women's rights are human rights. And pro-choice does not mean forced abortion and sterilization. Tremendous guts to say that in the middle of China. And then she went on to condemn the murder of female babies. You know, China has about 10% more men than women because of that. To condemn the murder of the burning of brides in India because their dowries were too small. To condemn genital mutilation, child abuse, and all of the problems in other countries and in the United States. Other politicians don't talk like that, you know? She did, and she was unique in the way that she does that. She addresses the issues that nobody else touches because they're her issues, they're important to her. Bill Clinton's issues are all abstract. Every one of Hillary's issues has a face, and most of them have a name. So this idealistic person, who I began to really like in the 1980s, who throughout the 90s developed this layer of phoniness, this veneer of a mask, this vicious ruthlessness, this financial acquisitiveness, none of which really was there at the beginning. The question is, will she be able to grow out of it? And in the last analysis, rewriting history is a cri de coeur, a cry of the heart, to ask Hillary Clinton, the real Hillary Clinton, to please emerge from these layers of paranoia. And it asks the final question, will she grow like Bobby Kennedy into one of our great heroes, or will she descend further into this pit of enemies lists and paranoia and lying and deceit and cover-up as Richard Nixon did? Will she grow? Thank you. Yes.
Very interesting comment, and I appreciate your being here to talk to us. In your comparison with Hillary to Nixon, it seems to me, and you know much more about these people than I, obviously, but I think that Nixon had an inferiority complex, and I don't think Hillary does. And I think that was part of the Nixon that came developed.
The question is, to what extent did Nixon have an inferiority feeling, and to what extent does that differentiate him from Hillary? I think you're right. There was a tremendous feeling that Nixon always had, that he was from Whittier College in California, and he had to compete with the glamorous Kennedys and the whole Eastern establishment, and that he had to do through great personal effort what they came naturally for them. But every politician always has the seeds of resentment. Everybody does. None of us grow up with it handed to us, although some of us do, but most of us don't. And we grow up with this chip on our shoulder about the difficulties we experienced when nobody paid any attention to us. But then some dwell on it and become steeped in paranoia, like Nixon, like Hillary, in a certain way like Bobby Kennedy did, steeped in a personal kind of vicious ruthlessness back in the pre-JFK assassination days. And some of us begin to understand that that desire for that grudge is overtaken by a feeling of incredible gratitude for what we've had. And we come to understand what we've had and see it and be grateful for it, and to see the glass as half full, not as half empty. The question is whether Hillary will make that transition. Yes, sir.
The sad and ironic condition that you referred to, which I agree with, the end justifying the means, which has infected our political process. And you describe in the case of Hillary, do you not see the same, to the same degree, in the other party, in Bush's absolutism, use of religion, his "you're either with us or you're against us," the sickness of not understanding that every means is a result from a prior means, and there is no real distinction between ends and means. And if you sacrifice the quality of the means, you're sacrificing the quality of the end at the same time. But that's one of the sicknesses in our country, and I think you're being somewhat unfair to just pick out Hillary. And I wonder whether or not your history with them doesn't create a spotlight on that one person when it's really a general issue.
Well, the spotlight is created by them. I mean, I didn't write the memoir, they did, and I'm just commenting on it. But your basic point, I think, is a very interesting one. I think it's true that in politics, to a certain extent, the ends always do justify the means, to a certain extent. But I think that has its limits. And I think that partially because they never engage in that kind of activity that requires that kind of cover-up. I don't really see the same capacity for playing fast and loose with ethics and morals in the Bush presidency. Now, of course, it's not appropriate to compare Bush and Clinton. Bush was born to the purple. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, or silver foot, as Ann Richards said. So there was never an issue of poverty. There was never an issue of threat. If Bill Clinton lost his footing on the ladder, he'd end up in the mud back at Hot Springs. If George Bush loses his footing on the ladder, his grandfather was senator and his father was president, and his family is immensely wealthy. So I'm not sure that the comparisons are appropriate. I do feel that Bush clearly has a feeling of empowerment in the war on terror, and a feeling that he's dealing with a particularly vicious and ruthless foe, and that sanctions and necessitates a range of means that go beyond what you would normally do in peacetime. But I'm not sure that that's inappropriate. I'm not sure that when you're dealing with Al-Qaeda flying into buildings, that it isn't appropriate to be more aggressive on your means. But all of that goes back to two basic questions, and let's talk about the substance for a minute. The first is the Patriot Act, and the second is the weapons of mass destruction. I believe that it is out of the question that George Bush lied to the American people deliberately over weapons of mass destruction, because I worked in the White House, and I know how hard it is to lie about something of that magnitude. With tens of thousands of people have the Washington Post on their speed dial and could easily call them and drop the dime on you and tell that story. I believe that Bush was misled by the CIA, and I believe that he and Colin Powell said what they believed to be the truth, wrong as it turned out to be. Well, let me just finish answering your question. The second part of the issue about ruthlessness relates to procedural issues like Guantanamo, the prison in Iraq, and also the Patriot Act. One of the things I write about in this other book that I wrote, Off With Their Heads, that was out last year and now is in paper, is that there was a crucial moment in the Clinton administration after Oklahoma City when Louis Freeh, the head of the FBI, came to us and said, right now, I cannot wiretap, I cannot search and seize anybody, evidence from anybody, unless I can get a warrant from a judge where I can name a specific crime at a specific date that I'm expecting them to commit. And I can't do that with terrorists. So can I just go after them if they're members of a terrorist group? And Bill Clinton said, no, that'll violate the civil liberties. You shouldn't be allowed to do that. And that was appropriate. Then Free came back and offered Clinton the same deal that Ashcroft offered Bush. Bush took it, Clinton turned it down. The deal was, okay, let's be permitted a lower standard for searches and seizures if we don't use the evidence in court and we don't use the fruits of the poisonous tree in the prosecutions. We'll use it for intelligence. We'll use it to throw the guy out of the country. We'll use it to stop the attack before it occurs. But we won't use it for prosecution. And Bush correctly, I think, said the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth and the Sixth relate to prosecution, protecting people against government locking them up or taking away their property. They don't stop the government from gathering intelligence. Clinton went the other way on that decision, said no. And the result was that when we arrested Zacarias Moussaoui, the 20th hijacker, for an immigration violation, he came to our attention because he was learning how to steer an airplane, not how to take off or how to land, just how to steer it. His laptop computer had on it the names of the 19 other hijackers and where they were taking flight lessons. And we had that clue in our hands 30 days before, and we couldn't access that laptop computer. So when I go through each of the judgment calls that Bush has made, there are some that I think might flirt with being over the line. Clearly, the abuse scandal in Iraq does, and it's the consequence of putting 21-year-olds on prison guard duty. They're just not equipped to handle it. But I think that there is not the same quality of an unjustified ends justify the means. Now, of course, if Bush were president in normal times, we'd know more about that. But he's not a president in normal times. Well, yeah, well, for 9 months. Yes, sir.
Mr. Morris, I just wanted to ask you, there have been several books written. I think Tom Minitor, Losing bin Laden, Lieutenant Colonel, I think Buzz Peterson wrote a book, Dereliction of Duty. And I know you've written a book also on how Bill Clinton did not address the Al-Qaeda and the terrorist issue. And I just wonder if you could reiterate what you...
In Off With Their Heads, I speak of 4 things that Bill Clinton could have done to avert 9/11. The first is the one I shared with you, the decision about lowering the standards for search and seizure. The second was that in March of 1995, I sent President Clinton a memo proposing that the federal government ban the issuance of driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, and that it take the position that a visa and a driver's license have to expire on the same day. So if you're here pursuant to a visa, the day your visa expired, your license would. Half of all people that are here illegally are here on visa overstays, came here legally and their visa expired and we never threw them out. Clinton rejected that. I proposed it 3 different times because he was worried about the impact on his political base. So when Muhammad Atta was pulled over here in Florida, Dade County, 4 months before 9/11, and was found not to have a valid driver's license, the cop went back to his computer and saw that he'd made no illegal left turns. But my proposal, which was to integrate the INS, the FBI, and the motor vehicle computers, had not been adopted, and as a result, we couldn't hold him. We didn't hold him. And 2 other hijackers were also arrested for speeding, and no action happened. The third is that when the same people, the Al-Qaeda, attacked the same target, the World Trade Center, in 1993, Clinton did not treat it as an act of war. He treated it as a crime. And therein lies the key difference between Clinton, Gore, and Kerry on the one hand and Bush on the other. Let me say I don't agree with George Bush on anything except for the war on terror. And there I agree with absolutely everything that he's doing. Because he understood at that point that this was a war. Clinton saw it as a crime. So the resources that were allocated to that investigation were minimal. Clinton never visited the site, never made a big deal of it, but it was the first terrorist attack on American soil. And the result was it wasn't until 1996 that we knew that bin Laden had been behind the attacks. So when Sudan offered us bin Laden in 1995, we said we can't hold him. We have no basis for holding him, and we didn't accept him. We said take him to the Saudis. Now, Clinton, in the CBS interview with Rather, denied that and said that was not true. Well, his national security advisor, Sandy Berger, has confirmed that we told them to take him to the Saudis. His ambassador to the Sudan, who is the intermediary in the negotiations, has confirmed it. And President Clinton himself, in a speech about 7 months ago, that was caught on tape, confirmed it. So I think it's true. And the final thing was that in 1996, in the summer of 96, after TWA 800 went down, there was a real sense of the need for air safety improvements. And I had recommended to the President 3 steps that ultimately were adopted and in fact polled them in August of 96. Federalize the security personnel, you notice how much better they are, X-ray all baggage and photo ID to fly. And Clinton and Gore were about to adopt those steps when pressure, largely from American Airlines, that said it would freak out people if they did these steps, those steps were not adopted. So even if Bush knew that 9/11 was going to happen, there was not the security infrastructure to stop it from happening. It was not illegal to take a box cutter on an airplane, for example. You could have shown it to the flight attendant and say, see how sharp this is, and put it back in your pocket and fly. There was no basis for excluding them. Yes.
Mr. Morris, 3 quick questions. One, Linda Tripp said she was in the same office with Vince Foster the afternoon that he said, goodbye, I'm going home for the afternoon. And Linda Tripp said there was nothing whatsoever that indicated to her that this was a man on his way out to go blow his brains out. You've mentioned that Hillary engaged detectives to extensively call upon the former girlfriends of Bill Clinton. Is it conceivable that these detectives, or in any way whatsoever, there could have been a connection between Vince Foster and Hillary at all? Secondly, may I also ask, just from your own experience with the Clintons, it seems as though there's a script involved regarding their personal life, and the script goes something like this, that they're a couple that has marital bumps every once in a while, but they seem to have a personal relationship, and if Bill somehow makes a mistake every once in a while, well, he's real sorry, he sleeps on the couch, and she's the maligned woman for a while and gets a lot of sympathy. But on the other hand, according to Jennifer Flowers in her book, Hillary has had more women than Bill has had, according to Bill. And from what you have seen, is Hillary a lesbian? Is it sort of like a Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt relationship?
You were doing well till the very end, but okay. Let me start with the Vince Foster thing. I have a very high regard for Kenneth Starr. I met him on a cruise in the Caribbean, where I was invited to be a speaker, and so was he. And I didn't know he was going to be on the cruise till he showed up. And it was 1 week after Clinton left office. So in my speech on the cruise ship, I said I only agreed to give this speech because my boss relinquished control of the submarine fleet 1 week ago. And he gave up a Supreme Court nomination to be the special prosecutor. And he went after Packwood before that, impartially and honestly, a Republican senator. And he was on the fast track to the Supreme Court, would have made a heck of a justice. And he has assured me that there is nothing there about Vince Foster. And he said that in private, and he said it in public, and he's obviously not biased in their favor. So I believe if it was there, he would have found it. Now, your second question, first, I don't know. I have no idea what any of them do in private. But let me just say this about their relationship together. I believe that before Monica Lewinsky, Hillary is a person who is capable of the full range of normal human emotions. She's a normal human being in that regard. Bill is not. Because of his background, perhaps he's emotionally stunted. And the headlight reflector, he gives you empathy and you'd swear it's emotion, but it's really just empathy. It's giving you back what you give him. So I believe that Hillary genuinely and deeply loved Bill. And I believe that Bill genuinely and deeply loved Bill. So I believe they had a great deal in common. And I believe that it is no coincidence that this very elusive man, very, in a sense, withholding man in private, showered her with love and affection and attention and political power when she covered for him. And she got health care reform in return for Jennifer Flowers, and she got a Senate seat in return for Monica Lewinsky. You know, some guys get necklaces, but, you know. But the point is that I believe that exchange where she acquires power and affection and emotion is kind of like many abusive relationships, and I think that was the cycle that was going on at the time. I haven't spoken to either of them since 1998. So I don't know the current state of play in the marriage, but my impression is that they basically are not together in Chappaqua. Most people I've spoken to in the town say they see him a lot, but they never see her. And I believe that, but I believe they're closer than they've ever been, because he is her fundraiser, her advisor, her political consultant, her guide, her liaison to the Democratic Party. He is, in a sense, her everything. And one of the really good things about Bill Clinton is there's not a sexist bone in his body. And he would willingly play the role for him that Hillary, play for her the role that Hillary played for him.
The last day in office, Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich. Now, normally the president pardons convicted convicts. This guy was a wanted criminal, though, right?
Yep.
Wasn't
a fugitive.
A fugitive, right. I'm not sure. How did that come about, and how come he got away with it?
Well, to understand the Mark Rich pardon, you have to understand the Clinton Library. The presidential library is administered by a board that is appointed by the president and serves at his pleasure. And he can replace them anytime he wants. He can name anybody he wants. There's no confirmation. And the board decides how that money is going to be spent. So the presidential library is as close to a slush fund as you can get. And it, for example, has an apartment for Clinton in Little Rock, a summer house, and goodness knows what in terms of staff and airfare and all of that. So when Denise Rich gave $1 million to the presidential library, that was about as corrupt as anybody giving a paper bag full of $20 bills to a president. He could use it as he wished. And I believe, obviously, there was a connection between that bribe and the pardon of Mark Rich. And Mark Rich was pardoned, by the way, and has still refused to come back to the United States, still refused to subject himself to the federal judicial process. But that's not the pardon that bothers me the most. There are two that bother me the most. One is Carlos Vignali, and Dan Rather should have asked that. You know, ultimately what Mark Rich did was defraud a bunch of people. But what Vignali did was to sell cocaine and crack to the city of Minneapolis. And he was described by the federal prosecutor as being one of the drug kingpins in importing cocaine from California to Minnesota. And he was given a very long sentence, and he was let go, completely pardoned, sprung from jail, because his father was a major contributor to many of the Clinton causes and Clinton funds in California. That one disturbs me the most. The other thing, which is also not mentioned at all in living history, are the 3 pardons that were given to Hillary's brother's clients, one of whom was a carnival owner, one of whom was a swindler, one of whom was involved, I believe, in drugs. But the point is they were all clients who paid the brothers, and the brothers in return gave them pardons. Now, Clinton claims, or Hillary claims, Clinton I don't think has spoken out about this, that she did not know that her brothers were pushing for pardons. Well, if she didn't, she was the only one in Washington that didn't know. And if you're the president and you're about to pardon someone who is represented by your wife's brother, and she's a politician, you would tell her, right? You would go to her and you'd say it. And if you wouldn't, it would be because you figure they have a hold over her and you want her to be able to preserve deniability. It is the refusal to mention any of those in the memoirs that really gets me in terms of the pardon issue. Yes, this lady. Just wait a minute. Let her get the mic over there.
You are definitely a pragmatist. If Hillary Clinton called right now and asked you to manage her campaign and take her to the level that you want, would you say yes?
No, I'm not that pragmatic. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by Putin's recent remarks agreeing with Bush's conclusion that Saddam was connected with the weapons. And what fascinates me the most is the timing of that admission. Do you see anything in that?
Well, I was in Russia a couple of months ago, or a year ago, right around the time of the war. And I said there's a 3-cornered table in the Oval Office where Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt ran the world. And Blair and Bush were waiting for Putin to occupy his place at that table. But instead he went to the Quai d'Orsay, where with Germany, France, and Russia, over beer and champagne and vodka, they toasted their demise as world powers. And I think that Putin understands that he missed the boat on this. And I think that he understands the need for him to backfill. I also think that Russia understands its vulnerability to the Muslim terrorists. We're not the country that's within a couple of 100 miles of them. We're not the country that shares a 500-mile border with Iraq, with Iran, and a 500 or more mile border with Afghanistan and borders with Pakistan. They are. And I believe that they understand that threat. And let me say this about the weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein is a weapon of mass destruction. I believe terrorists are like HIV viruses that circulate in our bloodstream. They swim around, but they don't do you any real harm until they actually latch on to a cell. A terrorist by himself can blow up a mailbox, can do a suicide bombing, but they can't knock down buildings. They can't hijack planes and use them in that way. They're not powerful enough. But when the HIV virus hits a cell, it uses the DNA of that cell to give you AIDS and make you terribly sick and perhaps kill you. When a terrorist takes over a country, they use the DNA of that country, the conscript population, the military, the naval facilities, the diplomatic corps, the foreign aid, the foreign currency, foreign exchange reserves, the diplomatic missions, the import-export trade, the secure training facilities behind secure borders. They use all the accoutrements of nationhood to empower their terrorist act. And when the nation you're talking about gets $100 million a day of oil revenues, that's a whole lot of empowerment that's possible. Now, Saddam was effectively hamstrung until 1996 and 97, at which point, under the French and Russian and Chinese initiative, resisted by Clinton, resisted by the United States, he was permitted to export 1 million barrels of oil a day, and then 2 million, and then 3 million, and then the inspectors were pulled out. And we now know the bribery that accompanied that. But the point is that he only recently got the money. And he only recently got the money without the inspectors breathing down his neck. And he only has had 3 or 4 years to do that. So it took time for him to rebuild his inventory. Why didn't the United States wait until he acquired weapons of mass destruction to invade? Well, first of all, we thought he had them. But secondly, the impetus that 9/11 provided, the absence of isolationism, the understanding that these issues are important and come right home, kindled a national energy that needed to be tackled, needed to be tapped into to destroy these regimes, that needed destroying. There are 7 or 8 regimes, and Bush is going one after the other to tackle them. Some he doesn't have to invade. Libya, Gaddafi flipped because he saw what happened to Saddam Hussein. Syria is obviously cowed. I believe that if Bush is reelected, Iran and North Korea are going to cave pretty quickly. I think what's holding them up now is the feeling that they can get rid of Bush and nobody will take them that seriously. They'll go back to the days of Clinton where you just wink at North Korea and pretend everything's fine. But I do believe that ultimately you need to go toward each of these nation states. And the fact that there may not have been a relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda doesn't bother me a bit. Al-Qaeda is only one of a number of terrorist organizations, and Saddam Hussein himself is a terrorist organization. So I believe that it was very ample, that invasion was very amply justified. What I don't agree with at the moment is this insistence on staying there and committing our manpower to making Iraq a democracy. I don't think making Iraq a democracy is worth the life of a single American soldier. I could care less if Iraq is a democracy or not. There are 22 members of the Arab League. None of them are democracies. They're theocracies, because the Arabs come back at you and they say, why should we accept the view of people who are inherently evil as opposed to following the will of Allah, who is inherently good? And you sort of don't have an answer for that if you accept that context. So I believe that the United States should not be the world's policeman. My brother-in-law Joe Maxwell gave me this line, but should be the world's fireman. It should intervene to put out the fires and then move on to another fire, not bog ourselves down trying to administer a country. And maybe we lose the oil revenues. Maybe we don't get an economic benefit for the invasion. But who cares? We didn't go in for oil and we shouldn't stay there for oil. Just wait a minute. Yeah, go ahead.
You described extremely well how Hillary is already running for 2008 with 127 IOUs. How will she position her support for John Kerry while clearly she's hoping for a defeat?
Well, I think that clearly Bill and Hillary do not want John Kerry to win because they want Hillary to have an open White House to run for. So if you wanted John Kerry to lose and you couldn't come out and attack him because that would screw up your credentials in the Democratic Party, what would you do? Well, one of the things you might do is bring out your memoirs 5 weeks before the Democratic National Convention and suck all the oxygen out of the air, get all the attention. And the other thing you might do is, under the guise of book signings, come to a place like this on July 22nd and sign books and dominate the Miami media market when you're doing it. And believe me, comparing John Kerry and Bill Clinton, that is no contest. One is charismatic and warm and affectionate and polished and used to appearing in public and has a tremendous base of support. Kerry is uptight and inexperienced and new to this game. In 8 years, maybe he could be half as good as Clinton. But now he'll come across as definitely far, far second best. You might do all of those things. You might even schedule a book signing on the first night of the Democratic National Convention to distract attention away from John Kerry. You might do all of that stuff. You might. Okay, one more question. Yes?
Do you not see a difference between Afghanistan, which you haven't mentioned, and Iraq? I, for one, was totally in favor of the invasion of Afghanistan to take out the Taliban, which was directly related to 9/11 and clearly related to it, as opposed to attacking Iraq on the assumption that that madhouse that's Hussein, remember Baghdad Bob?
Yeah.
I mean, that place was a madhouse that we...
Well, the question, I believe that Afghanistan clearly was a more compelling and immediate target than Iraq. Obviously, we had to deal with that. Obviously, they were directly responsible for the 9/11 attacks. But the United States government, for 15 years, has included Iraq in a very select list of 8 or 9 countries that we have characterized as countries that sponsor terrorism. In 1995, I wrote a speech for Bill Clinton naming Iraq, Iran, Libya, and North Korea as countries that sponsor terrorism. Richard Clarke killed it, took it out of the speech. Then 2 or 3 months later, Clinton was speaking in San Francisco, and I put the line back in the speech. And again, the NSC took it out. And then Clinton called me from San Francisco and said, "Do you still have that language? I'd like to put it in the speech." So I faxed it to him, and he included it. And he said, "But don't tell the NSC that I did that." But the point was that it was very clear, and it has been clear for 15 years, that Iraq is a uniquely outlaw nation. It is, in fact, in my judgment, the 3rd worst nation on the planet, exceeded only by the Taliban, now out of business, and North Korea. Worse, well, not in control of a country. Worse by far than Iran, worse than Saudi Arabia, probably worse than even Libya. And so I believe that it was absolutely a necessary action to invade Iraq. And I believe that, thank the Lord, that we had Bush, as misguided as he is on so many issues, running the country when 9/11 took place, and that's why I'm supporting him for re-election. I'm the only guy in the world that voted for Gore in 2000 is going to vote for Bush in 04. Thank you.